So don't forget that the next reflection paper is due tomorrow, so make sure to complete that and get that submitted, either through Blackboard or you can send it to me as an email attachment. Also, don't forget that 1 week from today is the next exam. Be looking over the study guide. If you have questions from the study guide, by all means get in contact with me. But it's pretty similar in formats, and the types of questions that will be asked, only focusing on chapters 8 through 16. So there won't be any material on there from the first 7 chapters, the first exam, unless it is somehow directly related to something that was in chapters 8 through 16. So don't forget that that's coming up as well, right before spring break, so you don't have to worry about studying over spring break. Get that out of the way for you. There are just a few last comments I wanted to talk about related to the end of chapter 13, where we finished up on Tuesday, talking about the mark of the beast and the number of the beast, seeming like, at least my understanding, the one that I support, that it is probably some form of what is known as gematria, and some sort of alphanumeric calculation of someone's name. Now again, it's hard to go from the number to the name, but if you have a name, you can go to the number, right? If you know kind of how to calculate it. And the one suggestion that I think has the most weight is Nero. But one of the things we talked about was, it works for Nero in Hebrew. It does not work for Nero in other languages. And we made the point, right? If a name doesn't work, switch the language, add a title, or all sorts of things that people have done. The same kind of thing here. And so, again, this is not something I'm 100% behind. This is the only correct interpretation of this. The symbolic view that this just kind of refers to the imperfection of humanity has some weight to it. I mean, I can certainly see how some people might find that a better fit. But I think that the phrases of using wisdom and calculating suggest gematria. Now, one of the things that we talked about, we finished up with on Tuesday, was this idea of, well, why using Hebrew when the audience is Greek-speaking, and the rest of the rest of the book is, of course, written in Greek. But John has made allusions to Hebrew languages before. The king over the locust is known as Apollyon, but also in Hebrew, Abaddon. Right? So he has made reference to Hebrew before. Of course, he doesn't in this context. And he is expecting his audience to know a bunch of Old Testament allusions that they can pick up on fairly easily. And so just because it's Hebrew and a Greek-speaking audience, that while it does carry some weight, doesn't completely rule it out. Other people might say, okay, well, early Christians didn't talk about 666 this way. Well, early Christians didn't spend much time talking about Revelation anyway. It seems like by the 3rd and 4th century, Christians, there were a lot of different views by early Christians as to what it applied to. And there are some rather early attempts to identify 666 in other ways that would be different from Nero. But one of the things that I think kind of solidifies it for me is the Nero Redavidus myth that was a very, very important part of early 1st century culture. Now, Nero killed himself in the year 68 due to kind of some falling out of some favor with the government. But the eastern part of the Roman Empire especially refused to believe that Nero was dead, and always assumed that his death was somehow some sort of scheme or ploy. And there were rumors that he would return, and also edicts, pronouncements circulated in Nero's name after his death. In the years following, the year or two following Nero's death, the empire was thrown into chaos and almost civil war as 3 individuals attempted to become emperor. It wasn't until Vespasian, who had, in the year 69, who came back from the siege of Jerusalem that would lead to the destruction of the temple the second time, he eventually makes his way back to Rome and becomes emperor. And so there was a lot of chaos and confusion. And so people believe that in this, Nero is actually still alive. In July of 69, a lookalike thought to be Nero was killed by a governor. Right? And he sees this guy that looks like Nero, thinks it's Nero. Turns out it's not Nero. Bad time to look like Nero, evidently. So this idea that Nero was still alive. In the year 80, a second pretender, who was actually backed by the Parthians, those enemies to the east, tried to depose Emperor Titus. And in the year 88 and around 88, 89, a third pretender was backed by the Parthians, but he was eventually turned over and executed as well. So there were these continual myths throughout the end of the first century about Nero and Nero's rebirth. Now, I'm not saying John is saying here Nero is going to be reborn. But what he's talking about, I think, if we connect it with chapter 17 as well, is that this revival of this mortally wounded head is suggesting that there was a coming king who was going to be like Nero. Right? And so he's communicating a warning to Christians about people that would be like Nero in the near future. But again, a lot of this is speculation. It's not rested on a heavy foundation. But what we can tell, and what we should be confident about, is that it made sense to that early audience. Somehow they were in the know about exactly what was going on. And that can be explained through a variety of things. A common background that they would have had that we don't have anymore. Right? Things that would have been transmitted orally. And Paul talks about this in his letters even. Right? You know how I was with you when I said such and such. Oh, okay. Well, we weren't there, Paul. Clue us in a little bit, right? So there might have been an oral community or oral tradition that hasn't been preserved. We also shouldn't discount the presence of prophetic teachers in these 7 churches who could reveal to people what that information was. Just like John is inspired, they too could have been inspired to clarify in those communities what it was. And so, however we understand 666, we need to make sure that we understand it in a way that is going to make sense to those first century Christians. And ultimately, we should, of course, see it as a warning. And this is, again, another part of that book where it has applicability for all time, even though it might have first century context. Don't compromise. Right? Don't compromise with Satan's schemes. And so that definitely is, even if we can never figure out what 666 is, we don't have to miss the larger message of don't fall prey to Satan's schemes to compromise. Ultimately, though, 666 is not a number we need to be superstitious of. It's not a number we need to be afraid of. It's not a number that should haunt us, and anytime we see it. To do so kind of plays into giving this number some power that it really doesn't have. Just like the beasts and the dragon don't have true power. The true power is in God. And so, don't be up late at night trying to think, what does this mean? And if I do this or do that, as the next new things come out, right? Apple Pay, right? Is Apple Pay the mark of the beast? No, right? Right? Even if my count's 666, no, it's not. Right? I mean, it's not Apple Pay. It's not Google Wallet. It's not any of a number of things that we can fall prey to. It's ultimately about this warning of not compromising against the dragon and his schemes. Any last questions or comments? We had to end really quickly on Tuesday, and so I didn't have the chance to open it up to get your thoughts, your comments on the mark of the beast.
Isn't it www worldwide where everything is like 666?
I'm sure you could probably make it add up to it, but I don't know that you'd have to stretch. But yeah, I mean that's the other thing is people concerned about other the letters and anything showing up in triplicate sometimes might seem like. One of the things that's really interesting about this, and again, it's made problematic here by us going in chapters, is seeing like chapter 12 through chapter 14 as one total vision. Right? This is all it's all unfolding to John as he's seeing it. And so he sees the dragon trying to stop the woman giving birth, trying to kill the male child, going after the woman, going after her seed, going after or raising up these two beasts. But then as we get into chapter 14, we see a different part of this storyline, and something that we kind of lose the impact of in a couple of ways. First, that we're reading this as opposed to seeing it. Right? And second of all, with this, taking it in blocks, which we can't help but do. Right? But trying to keep that context in mind is very important in all of this. Let's go ahead and start off with reading. If somebody would read verses 1 through 10, and then somebody else 11 through 20. 1 through 10 and 11 through 20, please.
Then I looked, and behold, on Mount Zion stood the Lamb, and with him 144,000 who had his name and his father's name written on their foreheads. And I heard a voice from heaven like the roar of many waters, and like the sound of loud thunder. The voice I heard was like the sound of harpists playing on their harps. And they were singing a new song before the throne, and before the four living creatures, and before the elders. No one could learn that song except the 144,000 who have been redeemed from the earth. It is these who have not defiled themselves with women, for they are virgins. It is these who follow the Lamb wherever he goes. These have been redeemed from mankind as first fruits for God and the Lamb, and in their mouth no lie was found, for they are blameless. Then I saw another angel flying directly overhead, and with an eternal gospel to proclaim to those who dwell on earth, to every nation and tribe and language and people. And he said with a loud voice, Fear God and give him glory, because the hour of his judgment has come, and worship him who made heaven and earth and the sea and the springs of water. Another angel, a second, followed, saying, Fallen is Babylon the Great, she who made all nations drink the wine of the passion of her sexual immorality. And then another angel, a third, followed them, saying with a loud voice, If anyone worships the beast in his image and receives a mark on his forehead or on his hand, he also will drink the wine of God's wrath, poured full strength into the cup of his anger, and he will be tormented with fire and sulfur in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb.
And the smoke of their torment goes up forever and ever, and they have no rest day or night. These worshippers of the beast and its image, and whoever receives the mark of its name. Here is a call for the endurance of the saints, those who keep the commandments of God and their faith in Jesus. And I heard a voice from heaven saying, Write this, Blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. Blessed indeed, says the Spirit, that they may rest from their labors, for their deeds follow them. Then I looked and behold a white cloud, and seated on the cloud one like the Son of Man, with a golden crown on his head, and a sharp sickle in his hand. And another angel came out of the temple, calling with a loud voice to him who sat on the cloud, Put in your sickle and reap, for the hour to reap has come, for the harvest of the earth is fully ripe. So he who sat on the cloud swung his sickle across the earth, and the earth was reaped. Then another angel came out of the temple in heaven, and he too had a sharp sickle. And another angel came out from the altar, the angel who has authority over the fire. And he called with a loud voice to the one who had the sharp sickle, Put in your sickle and gather the clusters from the vine of the earth, for its grapes are ripe. So the angel swung his sickle across the earth, and gathered the great harvest of the earth, and threw it into the giant winepress of the wrath of God. And the winepress was trodden outside the city, and blood flowed from the winepress as high as a horse's bridle, for 1,600 stadia.
All right, so essentially what we have here, as we're kind of starting, as we move from chapter 12 through chapter 14, and even the first couple verses of chapter 15, is that we're seeing the setup for the last set of visions, the bowls of wrath, and this kind of the last plagues of God. And so it's kind of like the stage is set, the actors are taking their places, and now we're seeing movement towards the end. And it starts off with John seeing the Lamb. Now, keep in mind here what John has been seeing. Right? He sees a woman clothed in the sun. He sees her giving birth. He sees a great red dragon. He sees these two beasts come up. And so we've been seeing, especially through chapter 13, a lot of evil. But now, right, now we see the Lamb. We haven't seen the Lamb, although there have been some mentions of the Lamb. We haven't seen the Lamb since chapter 8. But now he comes on the scene. It's almost as if the dragon will not be allowed to use these beasts uncontested. Right? The Lamb stands as a champion to stand against the dragon and the two beasts. And also, of course, we talked a lot about, through chapter 13, that there is a lot of imitation, right, going on, parody. Right? These are the beasts are weak imitations of true power. Well, now we see the reality of power. Right? The Lamb has power within himself, unlike the beasts who have to get their power from the dragon, and the dragon who has to get his allowance of power from God. And so the Lamb comes on the scene. But of course, we also have to remember, it says Lamb. And as we talk about, the characteristics of the Lamb are to be emphasized. What kind of characteristics of the Lamb do you think, when you think of a lamb, what kind of characteristics do you think of? All right, sweet and cuddly, right? Although now remember, this is a lamb that looks like it's been slain, right? So maybe not so sweet and cuddly, but that part's not reiterated. But this lamb is, well, he's essentially kind of almost a military leader, right? And again, that's kind of that, don't forget this lamb has lion characteristics too. He's both lion and lamb. And he appears standing on Mount Zion. Now, what is Mount Zion? What's it referring to? Okay, it can also refer to the dwelling place of God. How else can you think of Zion being used in the biblical tradition? It's also often used for Jerusalem, right? Jerusalem did sit on an elevated area, and Zion was a poetic name for it. Let's take a look just briefly at Psalm 2. We've referred to Psalm 2 because of the phrases about ruling the nations with a rod of iron, being a messianic prophecy. But also we have this connection here in verse 6. Now, just kind of get the context at the beginning of verse 1. Why do the nations conspire? People plot in vain. The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and His anointed. Now, probably in this context is speaking of the king of Jerusalem, but there's messianic context throughout this as well, right? So it kind of has this dual purpose. But note what it says in verse 6, and this is God speaking. I have set my king on Zion, the holy hill. Right? And so, it's these echoes of the Messiah as king, anointed by God. And so the Lamb here stands on Mount Zion. But another passage that also helps us with this, and helps expand it a little bit, is found in the letter to the Hebrews. Hebrews chapter 12. Now the Hebrews writer throughout the letter has been making comparisons between what Jesus offers and what was offered under the Old Covenant, with the sacrifices and Moses and the law. And at the end of chapter 12, he kind of makes a comparison between these two things in a variety of ways. But notice what he says in verse 22. Right? He's comparing it to Mount Sinai. Verse 22. But you have come to Mount Zion, and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to the innumerable angels in festal gathering. And so the Hebrews writer is using Zion as kind of to refer to heaven, the heavenly Jerusalem. And of course we'll see the heavenly Jerusalem later on in Revelation as well. And so, this name, being a name for Jerusalem, being a name for the place where God dwells, it's found throughout the Old Testament, especially the Psalms and the prophetic literature. Sometimes referring specifically to the Temple Mount, sometimes to the city itself. But what's being presented here is the Lamb in his rightful place where God dwells. And who is with the Lamb? He's with the 144,000. Now, the definite article, the, isn't there. And so your translation might have it, it might just say, with him were 144,000. Well, is there really two groups John's talking about? No, it's probably talking about the 144,000 we met in chapter 7. Right? It's the same group, even though it might not say the 144,000. They have the name of the Lamb and the name of the Lamb's Father on their foreheads. Now, why do they have the name of the Lamb and the name of his Father on their foreheads?
Because you should know them back in
Okay, so we can think of it as kind of ownership or protection.
Well, they were sealed earlier.
Right? And so kind of in the narrative itself, they have it because they were sealed back in chapter 7. Right? And so this seal representing ownership, protection. And of course we talked back in chapter 7 about 144,000 symbolizing all the redeemed. And it's not just a specific number, but symbolic of all those that belong to God. But why bring up the seal now? Why really emphasize it? Because he moves on to talk about something else.
They've made it through all those horrible things that have happened on the earth.
Okay, so they've made it through all those horrible things. Why else bring up about their foreheads and what's on them? Yeah, to kind of specifically contrast it with the mark of the beast, which would be on a person's right hand or on their forehead. Well, who are these people? Well, they don't have the mark of the beast. They have the name of God. They have the name of the Lamb. And so John once again sees, but then he also hears. He hears